Imagine walking through a medieval town where the granaries are empty, the fields are barren, and every face you see is hollow with hunger. Bread, the very foundation of daily life, has vanished. People are forced to search for food in places no one would ever think of today. In this video, we'll uncover the desperate and sometimes shocking things people ate during the great famines of the Middle Ages. When the bread was gone, people turned desperately to the forests and meadows. Suddenly, plants that were once ignored or even despised became the difference between life and death. Nettle, goosefoot, and sorrel were boiled into thin, bitter soups. Dandelion roots were dug up and roasted, sometimes ground into a coarse powder to stretch out the last handfuls of flour. But not all of these forest foods were safe. Many wild plants caused stomach pains or poisoning when eaten in large amounts. Yet starving people had little choice. In the north, moss and lichens were scraped from rocks and trees, dried and mixed with scraps of grain. The result barely resembled bread, but it was something to chew, something to trick the stomach for a few hours. Families often sent children to gather anything green they could find: leaves, herbs, even tree buds. In chronicles of the time, there are stories of people boiling grass into porridge, knowing it gave almost no nutrition, but still hoping it would quiet their hunger. These desperate meals rarely kept anyone healthy. Malnutrition weakened the body, and sickness spread quickly. Yet for many, the forest became their last pantry, a harsh reminder that in times of famine, survival meant eating what nature offered, no matter how strange or dangerous it seemed. But even the forest could not feed everyone. Hunger pushed people to look for ways to stretch the little grain they had left. And so appeared one of the strangest and most dangerous inventions of the Middle Ages: bread made from almost anything but grain. The inner bark of trees, especially pine and birch, was scraped off, dried, and ground into a coarse powder. Mixed with a handful of flour, it produced a dark, heavy loaf that filled the stomach but damaged the body. Chronicles tell of people baking with straw, chaff, and even ground-up reeds. The bread was so hard it could break teeth, and so rough it tore at the stomach from within. For peasants, bread was more than food. It was life itself. To lose real bread was like losing hope. Eating these substitutes was not only physically painful, but also humiliating, a constant reminder of how far society had fallen. And yet, people kept baking this non-bread because the alternative was worse: an empty table and the slow death of starvation. But when even bark bread failed to satisfy hunger, people turned to things that were never meant to be eaten. In towns overrun by famine, rats, mice, cats, and even dogs disappeared from the streets, caught, cooked, and eaten. Chronicles speak of markets where roasted rats were sold, not as a last resort, but as the only food available. Hunger also drove people to boil leather. Belts, shoes, saddles, anything made of hide was soaked, scraped, and simmered into a tough, bitter jelly. Some even boiled old bones over and over, drinking the weak broth as if it were soup. To eat these things was not just desperation, but survival, stripped of all dignity. Imagine a family gathered around a pot, not of stew, but of boiled boots. This was the reality of famine. The line between food and the inedible no longer existed. When famine reached its peak, even rats and leather were no longer enough. People turned to carrion, the flesh of dead animals found in fields or on the roadside. Diseased or rotting, it did not matter. Hunger silenced disgust, and what once would have been thrown away became a desperate meal. But in the most terrible famines, the line of human survival was crossed. Chroniclers wrote in horror of parents abandoning their children, and even of people who fed on human flesh. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, there are accounts of travelers being attacked for food, not for bread, but for their bodies. These were not common acts, but their very existence shows how hunger could strip away every barrier of morality. The Middle Ages knew hunger not only as empty stomachs, but as the fear of how far humans might go when pushed beyond survival. When the famines finally ended, the scars remained. Whole villages had vanished, fields lay empty, and survivors were left weakened by disease and years of poor nutrition. The population of Europe shrank, and trust in rulers, churches, and even neighbors was broken. Hunger was not just a physical trial. It reshaped society itself. The most devastating example was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For nearly 3 years, relentless rains ruined harvests across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields, livestock starved, and food prices soared beyond what most peasants could afford. It is said that in some regions, up to 10 to 15% of the population perished. In England, records show people eating horses, dogs, and even digging up freshly buried bodies. In France and the Low Countries, reports describe parents abandoning children at monasteries, unable to feed them. And this was not the only tragedy. In the 14th and 15th centuries, repeated local famines struck Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. Each famine left behind weaker populations, making them more vulnerable to the next disaster, especially the Black Death, which struck just a generation later. Historians believe that years of hunger before the plague had already broken people's strength, turning Europe into fertile ground for catastrophe. Yet, from this cycle of despair came transformation. Farming methods slowly improved. Better plows, new crop rotations, and more resilient grains. Trade networks expanded, allowing food to move between regions more efficiently. Some rulers even introduced granaries and early forms of food reserves to soften the next famine's blow. Famine forced humanity to adapt, even if at a terrible cost. And today, when food seems abundant, these stories from the Middle Ages remind us how fragile that abundance truly is, and how hunger can reveal both the strength and the darkest sides of human nature.